think it's just really clear what's happened, right? It's just inflation. It's Bidenomics at it again. Biden came in, and now G is not worth G anymore. It's got to be PG to be worth a G. Hello, and welcome to the Pop Culture Contrarian podcast with Thomas, Sterling, and Andrew. And welcome to our brand new, hopefully final setup. It's taken some work, but we finally gotten here. Today, we're going to be talking about the fact that Hollywood is bidding farewell to the G rating in theatrical releases. So, Thomas, I think you're the one who brought this topic to our attention. Why don't you take it away?
Yeah, this will be the first year in memory that I think that Hollywood will not produce a G-rated movie for the box office.
That is very surprising.
It is. I mean, since it was just, a little over a decade ago where it was a staple rating for a big money rating, generally for the studios.
And yeah, just list a couple G movies if you can. Well, I can do it if you want.
Yeah, why don't you do it? Because I'm like thinking.
All right, well, just a couple movies that I think everyone has seen that are G-rated are The Lion King, with the most traumatic moment ever for little kids.
Saw that in
Mufasa
theaters.
dies.
Yeah, I saw that in theaters when I was a kid.
And everyone has trauma from that, but it was G, and no one disagreed with it being G. And Aladdin, another Disney movie. Again, another movie that has, fairly intense moments in it. And these were both G, and everyone was fine with that. So,
Little Mermaid. There was a lot of them. Almost any Disney cartoon that would have come out in the 80s and 90s would have been like G.
Right.
And they're just doing away with the G rating.
They're not, be careful, they're not officially doing away with it. But
they're not making anything right now.
They're not making anything right now with it, and they've been progressively making fewer and fewer G-rated films.
Mm-hmm. Sure.
And this was kind of brought to light to me in an article that was not necessarily focused on the G rating itself, but the article was in the New York Times titled, Honey, I Blew Up the Family Film. And what it points to is that it seems that a lot of Hollywood studios have been kind of doing or making less and less of the classic family films that used to be, like I said, a staple of the industry.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So, Andrew, can you just take us through what are the MPAA ratings, which is, you see it at the beginning of the film. It says MPAA rates this, whatever. Mm-hmm. So can you just take us through what those were and what those are?
Yeah, so they're a little bit different today than they used to be. And most people may remember, but in 1968, that's when they were first introduced. And at that time, they had I've got it written down here, a G, a PG, an R, and an X.
X, that famous X.
Indeed. A lot simpler, a lot more broad, but today the ratings are expanded to G, PG, PG-13, R, and NC-17.
Okay, so the big change there is the addition of PG-13.
And NC-17.
Right, which substituted for X.
Mm-hmm. All
right, well, Thomas, we're gonna go back to you. So tell us a little bit about PG and what movies are PG, and what do you think about that?
Well, growing up, PG generally meant it was just a bit of a step up from a G. Mm-hmm. So there's going to be probably a little bit of language, probably a little bit more violence, kind of potentially stuff like that. But by and large, if it was PG, there was a sense in which, well, pretty much any kid can watch it. Maybe not your little toddlers, but pretty much anybody else. That was
the sense, but it didn't end up working that way, right?
No, because if you think about it, the first blockbuster film, Jaws, 1975, was PG.
Right, and that would not get a PG rating today.
No. And continuing to move down into the 80s, you have, I think, the film that kind of set off a bunch of the questions being Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom, which was also PG. And I think what people started to realize was we've got all these movies. We've got the G, general audience, then we got PG, parental guidance, and then the next leap, I guess, is to the R.
Which means you have to be
restricted. Yeah, that was the idea that, you had to be practically an adult. Mm-hmm. But I think it is fascinating when you go back and look at movies from the 70s that were PG rated. I don't know that at the time that they were necessarily considering it the way it kind of grew into our era as thinking of it like safe for kids.
Right, because that is what it means today. If a movie is
right.
PG, like because this is in the article, right?
Right.
What's the example in the article?
Well, okay, so this year there are kids' movies, but they've all been rated PG. For example, Paw Patrol 2 is coming out, and that is the cartoon, and it's being rated PG because of, I guess, scenes of.
Well, have you read
intense-
the rating? Because I have read it.
Okay, do you
So on the Paw Patrol 2 movie, the reason it's rated PG instead of instead of G, is because of mild violence and peril.
That's right. That's what it was.
Well, I can sure tell you there's mild violence and peril in The Lion King and Aladdin and The Little Mermaid and Tarzan and Mulan. All of those had mild peril and violence, or sometimes not so mild peril.
Well, in going back to PG and G, it's almost like what's happened, at least it seems like it. When the G came out, the general audience, that was almost, and we still see that as like, the kids' movies. But I wonder at the time if they saw, they looked at G as more like the way we look at PG today.
Which is, it's anyone can walk in and
kind of
enjoy it.
anyone can walk in and enjoy it. And because there are some even G films back in the day, you'll look back and you're like, how did this get a G rating?
Yeah.
And now we've moved to this point where now even Gs are seen as like so focused on almost like this toddler level, can't go beyond that. Like how Paw Patrol 2 would be considered not safe, so we have to get it to the PG
Thomas,
rating.
it's very clear. Paw Patrol features a cop.
A cop.
So clearly, it can't get a G rating.
Yeah.
Because ACAB, as we all know.
It seems like what's happened is the G has been relegated to this point of just being very, very, very milquetoast. Has to be nothing controversial at all.
Right. It's like
offensive.
the wall color back here. It's that,
Right.
It can go in any office building.
Right.
That kind of hotel art kind of thing is the only thing that qualifies as G.
That's kind of offensive sometimes, so I don't know.
Hotel art?
It's so boring, it's offensive. So now I think what's fascinating is it looks like we're going to get a lot of these PGs, and I'm just wondering, is the G just going to cease to exist? It's almost kind of like you were saying, kind of what we're titling this podcast. Is it just have new sensitivities come into how we look at film and how our culture's kind of shifted to the point where we're saying, well, there's not enough. If it's going to be a G, it has to be so.
Everyone has to agree. There's nothing wrong with it.
Right, and so maybe that's the reason it's falling out, and the safer thing is to just do it PG.
Well,
so go in.
Well, I was going to say, I think that if you look at the progression of how ratings have been created, that indicates, the culture seems to be more and more sensitive about what can be, or rather how things are labeled. So, for instance, and you mentioned a couple of films, I think it was Indiana and the Temple of Doom, and I don't know if you mentioned Gremlins.
No.
But so those are two films that were examples used for, hey, these really shouldn't have been a PG film.
Right.
And Spielberg put forth the idea of, well, how about we go with an in-between, because
the leap to R is too big.
Right, yeah, and that's going to remove too many people from the audience when it's really not that extreme. So the PG-13 came into existence. So I guess creating more of a granular scale.
Yeah. So hopping back a moment real quick, I think what you were saying about the PG and the G, though, I think it's just really clear what's happened, right? It's just inflation. It's Bidenomics at it again. Biden came in, and now G is not worth G anymore. It's got to be PG to be worth a G.
Rating Bidenomics.
Yeah. All right, Andrew, keep going. I'm sorry. I had to get that in there.
Yeah, so one, and we might talk about this later on, but I just want to briefly touch on it. I think that it's fascinating, the idea of labeling and making sure that people know, all right, this is appropriate, this isn't appropriate. So in that sense, it's, I guess, less tolerant. But I would also say, in many cases, the content of films is less appropriate, or the idea of what's appropriate is changing so much.
I think that last thing you said is hitting the nail on the head. I think kind of what's happened is it's representative of all sorts of things, but America is so divided. I think everyone agrees that America's divided. It's the one thing we can agree on, that you can't get everyone in the country from California to Virginia to agree on what is and isn't offensive. Something is offensive to everybody, and some things, some people are like, that's not offensive to anybody. Why on earth would you mark that as offensive? But to some people somewhere, it is offensive. I think that's a large part of what's happening here, that there's just not enough unity for us to say, this isn't offensive to anyone, we can rate it G.
Yeah, that's a good point.
All right, so you just covered PG-13. I'm going to dive into R. So the R rating has actually been doing something interesting recently, and I think it's probably related to the dearth of G-rated movies. In the 21st century especially, starting with the very first kind of blockbuster R-rated movie, The Passion of the Christ, which, you know, you might hesitate to call that a blockbuster, but it was. It made over $300 million in the U.S. From that point on, R-rated movies have been able to bring in big bucks in the box office. And before that, it was never really possible. But there was actually a big gap between Passion of the Christ and the next R-rated movie, and that made lots of money, and that was Deadpool. But then since Deadpool, there's been tons. And in fact, one of the most successful R-rated movies of all time is currently in theaters. It's Oppenheimer. It's getting close to $900 million, which is oodles and oodles for an R-rated movie.
Yeah, impressive.
Only one R-rated movie has crossed $1 billion at the box office, and I detest it. It's The Joker, or Joker with Joaquin Phoenix.
Yeah, and that wasn't just in the U.S.
Right. It didn't make all that much money in the U.S. Let's see, it made $335 million as opposed to Deadpool, which made $363, and Passion, which made $370. But yeah, The Joker, I just got to throw this out there because we're mentioning it. Don't watch it unless you want to graduate from being just a plain old incel to a domestic terrorist, because that's kind of the playbook it lays out for you.
That's terrible.
Yeah, it's not a good movie. It's not a good movie, and I think it makes you worse for having watched it. But yeah, R-rated movies suddenly have been making lots of money. We've been a little bit more tolerant of these movies with big, you know, violence or gratuitous nudity or whatever as a tentpole film you have to go see that year. So there is some maybe creep of values there where we're suddenly a little bit more okay with it just because we've been desensitized over decades.
And I think also because it is better defined that, hey, this is going to be this way. And so I think the directors are able to kind of focus in on audiences and be like, all right, this is going to be an R-rated movie, and because of that, we know we can do these things.
Right. That's absolutely true, and especially with Deadpool, Deadpool is a Marvel character who is insane, but he knows he's a comic book character, and so he says all these crazy things, but he just kills people. So when the movie was not yet out, there was a big push from Deadpool fans to say, don't make this movie if it's not going to be rated R. And that was successful. And that, I think, it did break a lot of barriers down on R-rated movies because of kind of the fan campaign saying, you can't tell this story not R-rated, because Deadpool has to be able to kill people.
Yeah. It's telling that the culture is simultaneously less permissive and more permissive.
Yeah, I feel like there's a shifting, intentionally a shifting of values that we've kind of, I mean, we talk about it or write about it all the time in the Patriot Post. One of the things I find fascinating is the things that they'll kind of highlight. You know, lots of times they'll have a little blurb next to the rating for why it received that rating. I mean, it used to be language, violence, nudity. Anytime you got that, you could for sure probably be at least a PG-13, usually an R. Now you're seeing stuff like contains smoking or
tobacco use,
or suicidal themes or something like that. So it's interesting how there's a certain sensitivity to things that has shifted somewhat. It's not that the others aren't still there. In some ways, some of them have been diminished. I think the language thing is still there, but my goodness, it feels like the concern for language, even in PG, is not what it used to be.
Yeah, I think there's still definitely hard limits on like cuss words. Like famously, any PG-13 movie is allowed one F-bomb, and so people ask these questions. You know, the Lord of the Rings: Return of the King is rated PG-13. Where would you put the F-bomb?
Right. Well, there's kind of that, you know, that joke of all that joke aside, but there's almost like this kind of legalistic element to it too, even with like the R rating. Mm-hmm. The R was considered like, ooh, maybe there's something in there that's not good for you to watch, and so it's restricted, so people really shouldn't watch them. And it's like some for sure, but you know, I think of films that were, you know, R rated that were very well. I mean, we talk about Passion of the Christ right up at the top of this list. I think there's a tendency of legalism that people can get caught up into and saying, oh, well, you can't watch that because of this. That R rating means it's going to have some bad stuff in it.
Yeah.
Not necessarily. It's going to have maybe some stuff that are going to, you're going to have to be mature enough, and that was the understanding behind it, mature enough to be able to be exposed to and interpret and understand what the stories that you're being presented is telling you about.
Can you speak more about that? Because I think that says something interesting about the onus of responsibility being on the consumer of the product, not on the creator.
Well, I think to be fair to the consumer product with a piece of art that you have not yet experienced, how are you going to know until you experience it, right?
Right, which is why the rating is a good thing to have.
Right, so the rating was designed to try to help at least enlighten to the consumer potentially what was going to go, what they were going to be exposed to in the film. So it's not that it wasn't legalistic in that sense, but I think it can be used in that sense where people would just judge something as, oh, that movie's rated R, it must be bad. Right. I remember I hear, like, I mean, especially if you grew up like in Christian conservative circles or something like that, I remember that was like, oh,
yeah,
R.
it was like viewed as, like people would confess it as a sin, like I watched an R-rated movie.
Right.
It's like, that's, I mean, that might be fine. It depends on what movie.
Yeah. So now that we're living in an era where we're watching so much stuff streaming and on, I mean, cable and streaming have just blended.
No kidding.
You know, and so
in the worst ways.
What I've noticed though is, and of course, cable doesn't have. It has a rating system. That TV has a rating system, I guess, but it's
we don't even know what it is really.
Yeah, there's this. There's a what TV 13, and then there's like TVM.
Yeah, there's something.
There's a mature audience.
It's
mature audience. Kind of
not a big deal. They don't have the big scary FBI scene and then the rating thing at the beginning of a streaming show. Right. So you just don't even pay attention to it.
It's a bit subtle. It will often list Y up in the left-hand corner of the screen.
Yeah.
But oftentimes you don't even notice it.
Right. But in streaming, you know, shows get away with stuff that an R-rated movie could not have gotten away with.
Yeah.
And they're marketed to the same audience as the R rating. Whereas if it was released in theaters, it would have to be NC-17. Like Game of Thrones could not have been released under an R rating. Would have had to be NC-17. And then no one would have gone and see it. Mm-hmm. But because it was streaming on HBO, which granted everyone kind of knew what HBO was, I think, because of that, it became one of the largest hit shows of all time.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So yeah, kind of to your point, there's been, it's kind of a weird. And one thing we've become very permissible about what we will accept and watch.
Sure.
Mm-hmm. But on the other end of it, we've got these newer kind of concerns that are coming out, creating, I guess you could say, concerns about what should be allowed.
The ratings take more notice of what are called triggers in society today.
Yes.
I think than they used to.
Yeah.
So it's like, oh, you're triggered by, I mean, pretty soon, certainly it's going to be you're triggered by someone being misgendered, and that's going to have to be an R rating or whatever.
Yeah.
It could be.
Or there may be a literal trigger warning at the beginning.
What they should just do is release a new category, B for bigot.
Oh, God.
And if you watch it, you're a bigot, and that's fine. You can enjoy the movie with no artistic censorship.
Usually, well, that would be an interesting spin on everything, wouldn't it?
Yeah.
We're rating you, not the movie.
Right,
yes.
right.
The ratings rate the audience now. It's not the film.
That would be funny. So I just want to throw in some stuff we missed on the PG-13. So we talked about the movies that kind of caused the PG-13, but I just think this is interesting. Andrew, can you tell us what the first movie to be released in theaters with a PG-13 rating was?
I know this one. It's my favorite film from the 80s, Red Dawn.
Red Dawn. And Thomas, you had a thought on that, didn't you?
I was surprised it was PG-13. I thought it was R.
Yeah.
I'm not surprised it's not R for me. I've kind of always assumed R meant there's going to be boobs in it. And
Yeah.
if there's not, then it's not going to be R.
It's kind of my assumption usually.
Right.
I mean, because it was Charlie Sheen.
They didn't know he was made of tiger blood back then.
Okay.
Yeah. Or whatever the crazy things Charlie Sheen used to say were. Have you, this is total rabbit trail, but there's an interview recently with someone talking to Charlie Sheen about his drug habits. And he's like, oh no, there's no drugs in this house. If there are, let me know. I'll get rid of them. And it's like, sure, you'll get rid of them.
Yeah, I'm sure you will. Charlie Sheen.
All right. We'll move on from our digging at Charlie Sheen.
Yeah.
Sorry, Charlie. All right. So overall, final, like big picture, why do you think we're not getting a G-rated movie this year? What core things do you think are responsible for that?
I think that it is partially a practical reason and partially a cultural reason.
Okay.
To the practical end, I honestly wonder if it may be a carryover from the pandemic, and just a theory, and that I know theaters are struggling to bring audiences in, and kids' tickets cost less.
So they're like, we're not going to bother getting the kids in. We need to get the adults.
Yeah, I mean, it's speculation on my part. I don't know if that's real, but it's just an idea.
Yeah, and PG has a bigger audience than G. So, well, theoretically, it should be the opposite, but that's just not functionally the way it works.
I know that often they will shoot for a PG-13 rating to get a larger audience than if they were going to hit an R rating. So the same may apply. Hey, let's push for a PG rating instead of a G because, and that leads me into the cultural reason. And Thomas, what you were talking about, how G at this point is just pretty much baby movies, toddler stuff. And parents aren't going to take their toddlers to go see a toddler movie.
Right.
Really. I mean, it's just, I know personally, as a father of 2 children who are 3 and under, it's...
So you're not going to take them to a toddler movie. Would you take your kids to see Paw Patrol 2, though? It's got mild peril and violence, Andrew.
I'd probably take my son.
Okay.
Yeah.
So just to clarify what you were kind of saying, is it they would move it up to the PG rating because it's a broader audience?
That's what I think.
Because the G has narrowed, is what.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying.
Now with the PG-13, it used to be in my mind the PG-13 was actually a pretty narrow audience, but they were trying to expand to meet this gap basically between the PG and the R.
Yeah, but I think with a PG-13 rating, you can get more high school age kids.
Right.
Yeah, I do think at this point in time, among people who go to theaters, PG-13 is the biggest category.
Yeah. That's interesting,
especially when
it would have been not when I was in the 80s when I was
right.
Kid.
Well, I think especially now, like in comparison to when you were a kid in the 80s, there's maybe less appeal for young people to go to the theater because they have so many options at home.
Yeah,
right. It's absolutely true. If a new movie's coming out and it's like, I'm gonna have to go back a few years, but the Sherlock Holmes movie with Ian McKellen where he's taking care of bees. I think that may have been an Amazon release, but anyhow, I wouldn't go see that in theaters. It's Sherlock Holmes, sure, but there's no action in it. It's just philosophical and Sherlock Holmes taking a little kid under his wing. That's not going to be a movie I'm going to go to the theater for, just because if I go to the theater, I want to see big, cool things that I wouldn't be able to see at home and hear amazing sound effects.
So the experience, I mean, that you're talking more to even the subject matter of the type of movie itself that people want to go see in a theater. And I think that might be a little bit conflating of two different things. Like the rating isn't necessarily informed by that so much. You think?
No, but the movies people want to see in the theater rarely are able to get a G rating. That's where they can.
That's what you're saying, suggesting. Yeah. Okay. I mean, I think the biggest impact to it, I do agree COVID I think has been an impact. But I really think the bigger is the streaming services. Because
good point.
Yeah.
Like you're saying, you would watch that movie and you'd stream that movie, but you wouldn't go spend money at
$15 on it.
yeah.
And that's just for the ticket. If I want popcorn, it's another $15.
And I'm wondering how much that has contributed to it too. So the type of movie that you're going to the theater to see, generally speaking, are probably going to be ones that are very visually stunning, and you're going to want that almost larger than life or larger crowd feel in when you go to see it.
Right. Like one movie I can say it's just better watching it in theaters is Avengers Endgame or Avengers Infinity War. When you were watching those movies in theaters with the crowd, it's awesome because everyone all roars when Cap picks up Mjolnir. My experience was not great because I had one guy sitting next to me who just could not contain himself at every scene, and I was ready to tell him to shut up. But usually it's fun to hear the whole crowd all roar in unison at the exciting event on the screen.
Yeah. I think coming kind of roundabout back to the article that kind of put me onto this subject. The writer, she notes that when she was growing up, how much being taken to the movies, and this was in the 80s for her, was so impactful for her childhood. And she pointed to some of the movies that were kind of considered children's movies that weren't just animated movies, like E.T., for example. Those, and I remember seeing E.T. in the theater as a kid.
And that was your trauma.
Yeah. I wouldn't say trauma, but it was definitely an emotional movie for me. And it's one of those films that you really almost feel more than you remember, that it creates that nostalgia impact. And our kids getting that experience, is Hollywood making those movies that are coming to the theaters that kids can experience in the same way anymore?
That's kind of a question you can only answer in 10 years, right? You can't really tell which of the movies coming out this year are going to be impactful for childhood.
I mean, that's fair to a degree, but I mean, if they're not even putting them out,
right, then they're definitely not going to have any effect.
I mean, so for you, like, what was the early movie you remember going and seeing as a kid in the theater that really, like, you're like, oh yeah, this theater's awesome?
Well, y'all already know the answer. It was Star Wars: The Phantom Menace.
Okay, that was your first movie. Do you remember?
No, I don't know if it was my very first movie, but I remember it came out in 99, so I was 5 years old, and I remember before it came out, I was begging my parents to let me go see it in theaters with them.
Okay.
I may have seen something before, but I don't remember what.
I was 10, and I remember it, and God, it was awesome.
Yeah, it was so cool. And
I remember
I was 5 years old. I loved Jar Jar Binks.
I remember seeing Return of the Jedi in the theater.
Heck yeah, man.
That's because he's an old man.
Yeah. That was fun.
I am jealous of that. I am
that's
jealous.
amazing.
Return of the Jedi was showing in some theaters earlier this year, but none of them anywhere near here, which was so disappointing because I would have gone in a heartbeat.
What did you go see nearby. when they re-released? Oh, you're too young probably too. When they re-released them all in the late 90s before they.
Yeah, no, I didn't.
Okay, I didn't. I saw them then again too.
Were those? Do you know if those were the special editions or the?
They were the special editions. Yeah, so they weren't the originals. Yeah.
So a lot of the G-rated movies are just going directly to streaming, we think. There's a great number of them that are just being rated PG, just because we can't quite agree on what's not offensive. Maybe there's just less of them being made because they don't want to have to sell kids tickets. Are there any other things that we think might be affecting that?
Well, I guess let's examine that a little bit. Is that the reason? Because they used to be, the reason they were making the Gs, a lot of reason, was because they were money makers for them.
Mm-hmm.
But it seems like they no longer are, even though, I mean, I guess that's the question. I guess you could say, is it economics? It's that they're just not making money for them, so they're saying, we're not going to bother?
Well, let's look at you can probably speak to this better than I can, but the effect that television and screens have on humans is... everyone at this point can admit, powerful.
Extremely.
Mm-hmm.
And I was just watching some parental blogger or something talking about this, and they were saying it's very rare for your child to just sit down and pay attention to what you're telling them for 2.5 hours, but you put a movie on in front of them, and they're locked in for that 2.5 hours.
Yep, absolutely.
So if you have the option to just lock your kid in with the iPad at home, why would you take them all the way to the theater? Because as a parent of young children, it's a hassle, right?
Yeah, going out on outings, trying to keep them under control in an environment where it is socially unacceptable to be loud and rambunctious. That can be an issue. And I think many parents, although I will say screen time is very bad for kids, keep it down to under an hour if you can. My personal opinion, raise your kids how you want. But the ability to just give a child a screen and provide them with some entertainment, or at least at an opportune moment, it's a different utility.
It's a relief sometimes, I imagine.
Well, and it's not like a family outing and a family event. It's not used for the same reason.
Mm-hmm.
So where there used to be the purpose of, okay, this is a family event, we're going to go and enjoy this together, and going to see a G film as they exist today isn't really a family event. It's just kind of for the kids, which is fine. But when you have the same thing at home that you can utilize to maybe get some work done,
right? Right, exactly. Or just you've got to make dinner, and so you just pop them down in front of the screen.
Then they're not having that experience that's the same as at the theater.
Mm-hmm.
That's what I was kind of pointing to.
Well, yeah, this is an interesting
Yeah,
question, though, because I think you're right that you're not going to be able to get your 10-year-old or your 12-year-old or your 15-year-old to go see a G-rated movie in the theaters unless it's a true Disney classic, the kind that doesn't get rated G anymore. Like, just so you know, The Lion King was G in 1994, but then The Lion King remake in 2019 was PG. It's the same movie.
Mm-hmm.
It's the same movie.
Yeah, but they look more real.
They look more real. It's still animated, by the way. I don't know why we call it live action. Anyhow, so the reason for this could be that we're just going to make PG movies because then you can get the 15-year-old and the 5-year-old and the parents to all go to the theater together so they can do it as an experience. But if Paw Patrol 2 is getting rated PG, that kind of undercuts that theory because I would not go see Paw Patrol 2 at 15 years old. You couldn't have dragged me to that.
No.
Well, it's effectively broadening it out.
Broadening.
Right. The PG rating. So what you're saying is this is why what you're saying, the PG-13 has become very popular, whereas I remember it was more of a rare thing because when I was growing up, I remember the PG-13 came along and people were like, well, it's got to have something dirty in it. That was kind of the idea because they're going to have, like you said, they're going to drop at least one F-bomb. There might be some, nude scene quick, or there's going to be certain level of violence. And so it was almost like a signal that, legalistically speaking, almost like it was going to be a movie that was intentionally trying to drop some bad stuff. Mm-hmm. But it sounds like it's moved to more the kind of, okay, we have a little bit more freedom here, or it's indicating, hey, this is not just a kid's movie.
Right. Well, that's what PG-13 means.
Right,
yeah.
that's what I meant.
Right, and you'd think they would want that. They'd want PG to mean that, but my theory is that it's the just disunion in this country. We just can't agree on what qualifies as unoffensive, and so we can't agree on what qualifies as a G movie.
I agree. I get that with the G. It's just interesting to me the division between the PG and PG-13 now.
Right. I'm just saying we can't agree on G, so G's going away, and now PG is absorbing that. Yeah.
Okay.
Which is reducing the utility of PG.
Right. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Makes sense.
Well, so I think that's why there's not going to be any G-rated movies this year. We've given several reasons. I think we've attacked it pretty well. Anyone have anything to add?
I'm out of thoughts.
We need the cricket sound effect. We're going to be doing sound effects soon, so.
Make G ratings for everyone again.
Yeah.
There'll be more. I'm sure there's going to be another G movie coming out eventually.
Yeah, there's no way they're done forever.
Right.
They're not deliberately getting rid of them. I think it's just kind of passively, financially driven reasons are causing them to not make G-rated movies. That's my guess.
Make G rating great again.
Right, yes.
Make G great again.
Yes. All right. Well, this has been the Pop Culture Contrarian podcast with Thomas, Sterling, and Andrew. We hope you'll tune in next time. The Pop Culture Contrarian podcast is brought to you by the Patriot Post, where we all work. It is the oldest of its kind on the web. It is right. It is free. Like and subscribe.